I was 20 years old when I decided to move in with my uncle Lucas and his wife Grace. I had been accepted into university to study architecture, and I thought it would be the perfect opportunity for a fresh start. I wanted to get away from my old life, the place where everything felt too familiar, and begin anew. So, when they offered for me to live with them while I settled into my studies, I jumped at the chance. The transition from my childhood home to their house felt surprisingly smooth at first. Lucas was different from all my other uncles, was calm, kind, and unbelievably polite. I'd never seen him lose his temper, and I admired his ability to always remain composed. Grace, on the other hand, was more lively. She was warm, approachable, but also a bit more spirited than Lucas. Their dynamic created a peaceful environment, and I quickly felt at ease in their home. It was exactly the sort of change I had been hoping for. But as the weeks passed, I started noticing things that felt off. Lucas's gentleness, his constant patience, and how he always treated me with such care at first. I told myself it was just his nature, and I would get used to it. But gradually, I felt like something inside me was shifting. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't that anything was wrong, but something about the way he interacted with me started to make me feel different in a way I wasn't used to. I kept trying to brush it off, convincing myself it was all in my head. Surely it was just my adjustment period, right? But it was hard to ignore. One night, after a long day out, I came home to the usual calm atmosphere of the house. I walked into the living room wearing a simple dress I'd picked out earlier and was greeted by Grace's familiar, warm smile. "You look great, Sophie," she said, her eyes lighting up as she looked me over. I thanked her, feeling her gaze linger for a moment before it shifted to Lucas, who was sitting at the dining table. He smiled at me in his usual way, kind, serene, but there was something about the way his eyes swept over me. It was so subtle, so natural, but it stirred something in me. I couldn't shake the feeling that his glance had carried more meaning than I had originally thought. As we all sat down to dinner, the conversation flowed easily between Grace and Lucas. They spoke with their usual ease. Lucas was polite, Grace laughed at his jokes, and everything seemed normal. But I couldn't stop thinking about the way Lucas had looked at me. Every time our eyes met, I felt this pull. It was like something unspoken was hanging between us. When dinner ended, I excused myself and went to my room, my thoughts a whirl of confusion. I didn't understand why his kindness and calmness were making me feel this way. It should have been comforting, but instead, I found myself caught in a tangle of emotions I wasn't prepared for. Later that night, as I lay in bed, trying to sleep, my thoughts kept returning to Lucas. I kept replaying the way he looked at me, the gentleness in his eyes, the attention he gave me. There was something magnetic about it, something that made me feel both safe and uneasy at the same time. I closed my eyes, but it wasn't Lucas's face I could escape. The feelings he stirred inside me lingered, and I had no idea how to make sense of it all. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through my window felt strangely calming. I got out of bed slowly, still feeling the weight of the night before hanging over me. As I walked into the bathroom, I tried to shake the thoughts from my mind, but they stayed with Lucas's eyes, his gestures, the way his presence seemed to fill the room. After a quick shower, I dressed in my usual comfortable Clothesa simple t-shirt and shorts and made my way downstairs, hoping that the quiet routine of breakfast would help me clear my head. Grace often went out early in the morning to do errands, so I usually had breakfast with Lucas. But when I stepped into the kitchen, I was surprised to find Lucas sitting at the table alone, a small cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up as I entered, his soft smile greeting me. "Good morning, Sophie," he said, his voice slightly warmer than usual. There was something different about his tone that made my heart flutter for some reason, though I couldn't quite explain why. "Good morning, Uncle Lucas," I replied, taking my usual seat across from him. There was a slight silence as I poured myself a cup of coffee. I couldn't help but notice how close we were sitting, how comfortable the atmosphere felt now that it was just the two of us. "Grace got some bad news this morning," Lucas said, breaking the silence. "Her friend's mother passed away, so she had to go out of town to be with her. She won't be back today." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. I could tell Lucas was genuinely concerned for Grace, but there was also something in his voice that made me feel like he was offering me something more than just polite conversation. His calmness seemed to fill the room, and I couldn't deny how much it drew me in. He wasn't just a good uncle, he was attentive, understanding, in a way that was becoming increasingly hard for me to ignore. "I am sorry to hear that," I said softly, trying to focus on my coffee as the strange emotions continued to churn inside me. Lucas nodded. "She's taking it hard," he said slowly, poking at his food. "But she'll be okay." I looked at him as he spoke, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, everything felt unusually intense. The space between us felt smaller, and I couldn't help but feel drawn to him, even more than before. As I sat beside him, the air seemed charged with something I couldn't understand. My body seemed to betray me, staying closer than I expected, my movements slow, as though I was compelled to be near him, to feel the warmth of his presence. I shifted slightly, trying to focus on the conversation, but my mind kept wandering. Every glance, every word Lucas spoke felt like it carried weight, and I couldn't figure out why. Why was I feeling this way? I had lived with him for weeks, and yet now everything felt different, more personal, more intimate. "Sophie?" Lucas's voice broke through my thoughts, and I realized I had been staring at him. I blinked, flustered. "Sorry, Uncle Lucas. What did you say?" He smiled softly, as if understanding my distraction. "Nothing important, just that it's nice to have a quiet morning for once." I nodded, feeling my cheeks warm. "Yeah, it's peaceful," I said, trying to regain my composure. But even as I spoke, my thoughts were still consumed by the strange pull I felt toward him. I couldn't deny it any near there was something about Lucas that affected me deeply, and it was becoming impossible to ignore. The day seemed to stretch out in slow motion. It was just Lucas and me in the house, and there was an odd, almost electric tension hanging in the air. I couldn't ignore it. It was like everything had shifted overnight. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking everything. But every glance, every soft word Lucas spoke to me made my heart race. And I didn't know how to make it stop. After breakfast, we both went about our day, but it felt different. I found myself lingering around the house, not knowing what to do with my thoughts. Every time Lucas came into the room, my pulse quickened. I couldn't help it. There was something about his presence that made me feel both safe and restless. I didn't know why. I should have just focused on my studies, but everything seemed to pale in comparison to the feelings that were slowly overwhelming me. Later that afternoon, I was sitting in the living room, working on some architecture sketches for my class, when I heard Lucas's footsteps behind me. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't expected him to come in, but he did, and it felt like the air had thickened around me. He sat down across from me, his eyes glancing over my work with a quiet interest. "That looks really good, Sophie," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "You are really talented." I looked up at him, and for a moment our eyes locked. I felt that pull again, the one that I couldn't escape. I quickly looked down at my sketches, hoping my face wasn't betraying the confusion I was feeling inside. "Thanks," I said, my voice almost a whisper. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, and I hoped he didn't notice. But he did. Lucas leaned forward slightly, his gaze softening. "You are welcome. You've got a great eye for detail." It was those little things' calm praise. The way he listened when I spoke, the way he seemed to care so much, that made everything feel even more complicated. It wasn't just politeness anymore. It was something deeper. Something I couldn't explain. A few hours later, Grace was still gone, and I was alone with Lucas again. We were sitting together in the living room, and the conversation was light. But underneath it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was an unspoken understanding between us. Something neither of us had said out loud, but we both knew was there. "I've been thinking about something," Lucas said, breaking the silence between us. His voice was steady, but there was something in it that caught my attention. I turned toward him, my heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" He hesitated for a moment, as though he was choosing his words carefully. "You've been living with us for a while now," he began, "and I know it's a big change. How are you feeling about everything?" The question felt loaded. He wasn't just asking about how I was adjusting to university life. He was asking something deeper, something I wasn't sure how to answer. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. How could I explain the storm of emotions that had been building inside me for weeks? How could I tell him that every time he looked at me, I felt like I was losing control of something I couldn't even name? That everything in me wanted to be near him, but I didn't know if that was right. "I am fine," I said, the words slipping out before I could think. I forced a smile, but it felt fragile. "It's just, everything's new, you know." Lucas smiled back, but there was a certain depth to his expression that made me uneasy. He nodded, his eyes scanning me in a way that made me feel like he was reading more than just my words. "I understand," he said slowly. "Change can be difficult, especially when you are far from home. But you are not alone here, Sophie. You know that, right?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure if he meant the words in the way I wanted him to. There was something in his tone, something comforting and yet unsettling, that made my heart beat a little faster. "Thanks, Uncle Lucas," I whispered, unsure of how to continue. My voice felt too soft, too vulnerable in that moment. We sat in silence for a long time after that. The quiet was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if both of us were thinking the same thing, but neither of us wanted to say it out loud. It wasn't until the evening, as the sky began to darken, that the tension finally broke. Lucas and I were sitting at the kitchen table, having a quiet dinner. Grace had still not returned, and the house felt too still. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional rustle of the trees outside, but it was the silence between Lucas and me that felt the loudest. I shifted in my chair, my stomach in knots. The emotions that had been building all day were finally reaching their breaking point. It was like everything inside me was on the edge of exploding, and I didn't know what to do. Lucas caught me staring at him again. This time, he didn't look away. Instead, his gaze held mine, steady and warm, and that was when it happened. Without thinking, without any warning, I stood up and moved closer to him. The space between us closed in an instant. Lucas didn't move back. He didn't stop me. Instead, his eyes softened and I felt his breath catch in the air between us. Sophie. His voice was quiet, but there was a certain weight to it, as if he knew what was happening, as if he understood what I was feeling. I didn't know what to say. All I knew was that I couldn't stop the pull, couldn't stop the way my heart was racing. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion, but something deep inside me was telling me to go forward. And so I did. I leaned in, and before I could even think, I kissed him. The world seemed to stop in that moment. There was no sound, no movement, just the warmth of his lips against mine. It was everything I had been feeling but hadn't known how to express. The kiss was soft, tentative, but it carried all the weight of everything that had been building between us. When we pulled away, Lucas's eyes were wide with shock, but there was something else there, something that mirrored the confusion and longing I felt. His hand was on my waist, pulling me closer without thinking, and I knew in that moment that I wasn't the only one feeling this. "Sophie," he whispered again, but this time his voice trembled. "I don't know what this is, but I feel it too." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. The storm inside me was only growing stronger, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what any of this meant, but I couldn't deny it. I wanted this, but at the same time, I was terrified. I didn't know how we had gotten here or what the consequences would be. All I knew was that I couldn't turn back now. Just then, I heard the sound of the front door opening. Footsteps. Grace had returned. The moment was shattered.